Here, this is the first of this year's People's Choice Lecture Series. We made the decision to put these lectures in your hands, and this is the result of how you voted back when you got that ballot about a month ago. Eventually we'll have a big fancy poster and all sorts of signs and that sort of thing, so I'm glad you're here in spite of our lack of advertising. Very special night though. We have Dr. Post, who I really don't know what he did in China this summer, but I know he went and taught there, so I'm just as excited as you to hear about his experience. And what I really want you to hold in the back of your minds is that while we're preparing you to start teaching in a public school, that might not be what you do. There are many, many opportunities for teaching, and of course teaching abroad is one of the biggest ones that's come up in the last 5 to 10 years. So let's give Dr. Post a real nice, warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. C, for making this opportunity. I appreciate it. As soon as I got back and was talking to him about China, he's like, oh, I know. And thank you to Chelsea, President Rand, and others who helped coordinate all these logistics and set it up. Seriously, that's very, very thoughtful and very nice. So, as you can see, here's a picture from China, right? So that's just a little overview just to get started here. What I want to do in the next, half hour or so is just talk a little bit about China, a little bit about society and culture there, things that I kind of learned, either trying to get prepared to go or learning on the fly or following it since then. I've become much more China aware since I've been back. You might not realize how Chinese culture, society, economics impacts your life, but it really does. But the only, I think, resonance that we have with China is when Mitt Romney says something like, they don't play by the rules, or that kind of thing. So that's about the only thing we hear about China, is that kind of thing, often in a negative context. But so I'd like to talk a little bit about the people, society, the culture there as I found it, and as it pertains to the students who I taught there. I did teach 2 music classes over a 6-week period down there in southeast China, and it was part of a really first-of-its-kind program that I'll talk a little bit more about too. Then, along the way, I'll just put in some anecdotal, travelogue kinds of stuff, like pictures that I took along the way and that kind of thing. But also, I think I'd be remiss if I missed the teaching opportunity here as well. I would like to talk to you a little bit about what it's like to teach students in another culture, which is a little different than teaching students from another culture in your culture. So, you know, there's some things that I learned along the way, even teaching classes that I really kind of knew inside and out. I taught a music fundamentals class, and I taught a music appreciation class. And, you know, the material wasn't challenging, but talking about these types of things with Chinese students in China brought on some new challenges and challenged me to become a teacher that could be more flexible and able to adapt my teaching style and strategies to the situation. So I think that could be valuable to you. I think it's true what Dr. C said, that you don't know what opportunities are going to present themselves to you, right? You really don't know. Here you are, launching out into your careers, many of you preparing for K through 12 teaching, but you know, at your age you're looking at a career that could span to the mid-21st century. And at the rate that things are happening, particularly if you think about countries like China that are quickly emerging and becoming major players you know, in the world stage, as we'll see when I talk a little bit about Chinese students in the U.S., you may have opportunities to teach in another culture, and you may not even have to go there to teach students in another culture. This could be something that could be done completely electronically, though I would hope you might get the opportunity to travel and do something like that. But chances are you will probably engage with teaching students in other cultures, or at least with other cultural backgrounds and biases. For example, Dr. C's probably had this experience too. I've taught the 200X course here a few times, and I've pretty regularly had a group of Chinese students in my 200X classes. Same with you?
Yeah, usually 5.
Yeah, and they often present some challenges to the teacher, because while they're here taking an English language course, presumably doing the work that we're all doing in our English language music classes, sometimes there are challenges to them with the material, and you really have to be aware of that dynamic in your classroom. So, with all that said, there is sort of a point to this, and I actually have a title here which I call Teaching Music in a Transcultural Context. So that's this the stilted kind of title here, but I really mean it. You know, this is something that's really significant. That's me, of course. That's a classroom of Chinese students in Guangzhou, China. And I didn't wear a shirt and tie every day. This happened to be a special occasion when we had faculty and undergraduates and graduate students all attending this special lecture that I gave. This was not really part of my day in, day out teaching. So, but you know, it's a good opening shot, right? A little bit about Chinese students in U.S. colleges and universities. You might be surprised by some of these data and trends that I'm going to put here at you. In 2011, there were 158,000 Chinese students in the United States enrolled in U.S. colleges and universities. Right there, that's a sizable population, right? Yeah, big number, isn't it? And that's up 23% from 2010, and it's predicted that that number is going to increase. Maybe not quite at that rate, but it's expected to increase. What is going on? Well, in case you didn't know, China's been going through a major economic boom and reform time in that country. The standard of living in China has rapidly increased. There's a middle class that's has much more presence in China than ever before. And along with that, the appeal of degrees from American universities has really never been higher, because along with economic growth in that country comes the need for more highly skilled and highly trained people in their society. And they simply do not have the cutting-edge training in some areas that we do, particularly in engineering, sciences, computer science. Also very popular are studying finance, marketing, business here in the United States. And what do? They go back to their country and enrich their culture with the knowledge and the degree that they receive here. So attending and graduating from American schools is a highly prized objective for many Chinese students. And the students that do make it over here are really some of the cream of the crop. They really are. It's not everybody can make it over here. There are dozens and dozens of fine universities in China, but the ones that actually study here are really part of the elite class in many respects. For example, the incoming president of China, his daughter attends university in the United States. She's an undergraduate at Harvard, so there you go. From the top down, they recognize the importance of fine education, and that the best education is still here in the United States. Just by comparison, India and South Korea are the cultures, the countries that have the next highest population of students, and it's way below where China's at, as you can see. Still pretty substantial numbers, though. Undergraduates make up only 40,000 of this, so 3/4 of the students that are studying here are graduate students studying advanced degrees. But still, 40,000 is a pretty sizable number. And these are the students who I was teaching and who my colleagues were teaching in our summer session. We were teaching undergraduate students who had spent at least a year in the United States, and they went back to China to take summer classes, and I'll explain how that works a little bit in just a minute. This enrollment of undergraduates is also increasing. 7 consecutive years, it's been up about 18% a year, so rapidly increasing. Right? By comparison, Mexico and Brazil are running pretty close behind. Over the last few years, we've seen 17 and 14% increases in the number of undergraduate students in American universities who are nationals of either Mexico or Brazil. The program I was involved in is called SIE, which stands for Sinoway International Education. This is a company that's a private company in China, so that's pretty cool right there. And it's started by a young man. He's still in his 20s, maybe late 20s, right out of graduate school, MBA, right, United States University. Right out of graduate school, he saw a need for this really first-of-its-kind program, which is to provide Chinese undergraduate and graduate students, but mostly undergraduate students, with U.S. standardized courses that they can take in English and use as transfer credit to bring back to their American universities. So the students come back to China for the summer, and they take 6-week summer session classes, just like our 6-week courses here, get a full semester of credit, 3 credits typically per course, and they can transfer that credit back to their U.S. institution. That's a pretty good idea, right? And with the kinds of numbers of students we're talking about, this program has just taken off like a rocket. It's only been around since 2010. In 2010, they had campuses in Beijing and Shanghai. By 2011, they had campuses in 3 different cities, and when I went in 2012, this year, I was part of the group that taught for the first time in the city of Guangzhou, so they had expanded to a 4th campus, and it's still growing. This coming year, they're putting permanent offices in Los Angeles and Chicago so that they can have stateside liaisons and make it a lot easier. So they're really looking at expanding this program. So we just call it SIE, that's what it's called. And there's just the first part of their webpage. Well, these are the 4 campuses then: Guangzhou, Nanjing, Shanghai, and 2 campuses in Beijing. One campus is devoted to undergraduate teaching, the other one is devoted just to business school teaching, and that's where some of the graduate courses are held. Beijing, Shanghai, more famous cities maybe than Guangzhou and Nanjing. You've heard of Beijing and Shanghai, right? Have you heard of Guangzhou? Mm-hmm. Oh, really? A couple? No? No. Nanjing? No, not so much, right? Well, the way to think about it, and this is really true, Beijing is, if you're going to compare it to American cities, Beijing is kind of like Washington, D.C. It's the seat of government, right? It's the capital for the country. Shanghai is like New York City. It's the 24/7 dazzle, bright lights kind of city, very westernized, more so than some of the other cities. Nanjing is a smaller inland country. It's known as one of the 4 furnaces because it's so unbearably hot there many times. I'm so glad I didn't go to Nanjing. One of the 4 furnaces. Right. And Guangzhou, way on the southeast, is, I would liken it maybe to Chicago. It's a big city, but it's a city that is a little more blue collar. It's organized a little bit more around commerce, commerce relating to agriculture and farming, and as well as business. It's kind of a hub city for the southeast near Hong Kong. And anyway, that's where I was. I'll tell you a little bit more about it. So here's a map. Guangzhou is way down here in the southeast. It's about 2 hours from Hong Kong, so you can take a train there real quick. Hong Kong's a really fun place. Very westernized city. They speak English with British accents there. As you know, it's a part of the British Empire for many years. Macau, down here, which is close to Guangzhou, is a very popular resort area, very westernized as well. It was colonialized 200 years ago. There's still lots of Western-style colonial resorts and buildings there. So Guangzhou is quite far from the rest of these campuses. And here's Shanghai, Nanjing, and then Beijing is way up there. It's about 1,200 miles away from Guangzhou. So that's kind of the perspective there for China. I was at a place called Sun Yat-sen University. Now what they do for this SIE program is they don't build their own facilities. No, no, no. Not yet anyway. What they do is they just basically rent facilities from universities during the summer and find available space, and they make it work. And that works pretty well. Sun Yat-sen University, though, is not, they don't even have a music department at that school. So that was a little tricky to try to get what I needed for my classroom there. They had to rent a piano, and they never did come up with a board that had staves on it. I had to draw my own staves on the board every day when I came into class. Chalkboard with real chalk. So a few challenges that way. But Sun Yat-sen University, that's where we were at. There are actually 10 universities in Guangzhou. And here's the north gate of Sun Yat-sen University. It's kind of an iconic piece of architecture there in the city. The city itself is the biggest city I'd never heard of. It's 12 million people. And it's only the 3rd largest city in China. I mean, 12 million, it's as big as Los Angeles. But it's packed into something much smaller. It's much more vertical. People live often in these apartment buildings that could be 30, 50 stories, and there's many, many of those around the city. But it's a very large, bustling city. Okay. Oh, here's some pictures from Guangzhou. I told you a little bit of travelogue too, right? This is actually shot from my balcony. So I was on the 8th floor of a 30-floor apartment building, and looking across the street, you can see we're dwarfed by these buildings here, right? There's a very busy little boulevard. Here's part of a place called Shamian Island, which still has some leftovers of British colonialism that was around in the 18th and 19th century. It's now just really kind of a park and a visitor's area, but there was a colonial presence there in Xiamen Island that went back quite a ways. Beautiful little spot there. Typical street scene, very narrow streets, lots of pedestrians, small shops and restaurants all along the way. And then this is kind of cool. This is a part of the Opera House that I'll show you some more pictures of later. It was built in 2006. There's not a straight line in the whole building. It's a really incredible piece of architecture, and this is just a walkway on the outside of the Opera House building. It's really kind of a nice shot. Here's an example of some of the really tall superstructures that dominate the skyline in Guangzhou. That's a huge skyscraper there. I took that shot coming out of the metro subway, and there it was, and made a nice picture. But on the north side of town, there's just incredible amounts of development. There's just cranes and booms and things building skyscrapers all over, as they just can't keep up with the economic development and growth in the country. Okay, on to teaching, right? Chinese academic culture and some challenges to our Western style academics. So a couple pictures of a Buddhist temple on the right and a pagoda, which is about 600 years old and still used as a Buddhist pagoda on the left. Chinese culture, of course, is very old. It's ancient, right? I mean, if you put it in terms with the West, you know, a lot of their culture that is still runs continuously through their society in terms of how it influences education, for example, goes back to the time of Abraham in our tradition, right, the biblical times. Some of the great doctrines that were written and that are still studied by students come from about the time that Moses, the books of Moses from the Old Testament were written. Confucius, who was one of their great teachers and one of their great editors of the great books, lived at the same time that Socrates lived. It's a very ancient and old culture. It's a very continuous culture, though, and in some ways a very insulated culture. My point being that a lot of the academic culture that the students come to you with is also imbued with a lot of their philosophical culture as well. It's very deeply ingrained and embedded in the students. And this can present some challenges to our Western style academics in the way that we present material, the way that we conduct a class, the way that we expect students to learn and respond is sometimes not quite in agreement with how the students are used to attending a class, partaking in a class, and responding in a class. And it really kind of goes between Confucius and Socrates, if you think about it. What's the Socratic method of teaching? It's dialogue, all right? It's ask the hard questions, challenge your students, get answers, be interactive, demand more from your students. They need to respond. What's the Confucian style? Well, it's really the opposite of that. I'll talk a little bit more about that right now. The Confucian doctrine of learning is this, and you see this reflected even in these young students who look so westernized on the outside with their rather Western garb, and they got the earbuds in all the time and listening. You know, I mean, they look just like Western teenagers in a lot of ways, but when you get them in the classroom into a structured learning environment, this is what you tend to find. First of all, there's the utmost respect for your professor. And this can actually work for you and against you. A lot of professors might say, I'll take a little more utmost respect, right? But it can also inhibit the classroom. Do you see how that might happen? Yeah. I mean, the students are very hesitant to dialogue with you in the classroom, especially in front of any other students. They're even hesitant to dialogue with you outside of the class, which we are not, right? Right? We're like, you know, knock on the door, hey, what's up, what's going on? But that would never happen. As a matter of fact, one of the students who called herself Joanna, since they all adopt English names when they're in English classes, Joanna used to come up to me, if she had a question, she had a lot of questions, she was a very good student, but she would always come up and she would like do this, and then she would go, most honorable professor. And I had to like say, please don't call me that. So I got her down to honorable professor, and then just professor. She after about halfway through, she was finally like professor. But you know, this is just the way she's used to addressing anybody. It's a completely vertical relationship between teacher and student. Utmost respect for the professors. Can be nice, but it can kind of work against you, especially in a class where you want to be interactive. And of course, teaching fundamentals, you'd love to have an interactive classroom. Teaching music appreciation, where you're doing listening and discussing pieces of music and art and things like that, you'd love to make it more interactive, but they're very resistant to that. It's just not the way that they've been, you know, conditioned to participate. Also, there's the avoidance of criticism and confrontation. And this is more than just being polite. I mean, it's nice to be polite, right? But they don't want to criticize one another, so you never hear counter opinions between students in the class. You would never hear a student saying, I don't agree with that, or I see it another way. And if you put a question out there that asks the students to evaluate something critically, they won't do it, typically, without a lot of prodding. But so there's an avoidance of criticism because it's often seen as confrontation. They avoid confrontation. This has to do with the idea of saving face, which is really an important thing. Saving face means, first of all, that you would not put yourself in a situation where you might say something critical or disparaging about another person, because that would cause that person loss of face, which is loss of public respect. To openly criticize someone, to expose someone, would be just a terrible social miscue, right? And this applies to the professor too, meaning that sometimes students won't even ask questions in class because they have the perception that if they're asking questions, that means the teacher's not teaching well enough. There shouldn't be questions because the teacher should be supplying them with everything they need to know. So if you have a question, they'll just sit there. They won't ask the question. They might come up later and say, most honorable professor, but they will not openly just put their hand up and ask a question in the classroom. You really have to work to draw things out of them. And they're doing it really because they think that is the way to be polite, to save face for the teacher. Right? Here's something that's interesting too. Memorization is more important to them than analysis or exploration of ideas. They work really hard. They may have trouble reading an English language textbook, but if you assign them to read 40 pages overnight, they will do it. They will read 40 pages, and when they come back in, they will not have only highlighted and underlined, but they'll have Chinese characters written all over by the English language letters to clarify things for themselves. They will work like crazy, and they will memorize large chunks of material too. They prefer to do that as opposed to thinking in terms of open exploration or analysis of an idea. They're not really good with open-ended kinds of assignments or open-ended types of reading or questioning. But they're great with memorization. How is this good? Well, it's good because they work really hard and they're very diligent. How is this bad? When you ask them, like in an essay-style response or, compare and contrast question, what you'll tend to get is like memorized bits of data that are just written out there. Almost complete paragraphs from the textbook memorized and written out. That's the kind of response you'll get because that's what they think is knowledge. That's what they consider to be showing what they know. So hesitant again about analysis and exploration, but great at memorization and working really hard.
Dr. Brooks,
yeah?
Did you study this before you went over there?
No.
Or did you
No. I'll tell you a little bit right now about how I even got into this thing and what I did know. I found out about this. I actually got an airmail letter in a brown envelope, and inside was an invitation to teach in their summer program. If I was interested, would I respond and let them know what classes I might want to teach? I had no idea what this was. No idea, but it was an airmail letter with my name on it. I later found out that one of my colleagues who I studied in my doctoral program with at Kent State had referred me because he was not able to teach and said, I know somebody who might want to do this. And I got referred, so that was pretty nice, but I had no idea. And going in, they didn't really prep you for any of this kind of experience. I mean, I did some research and studying and reading on my own, but they didn't really have a course or any kind of particular instruction about here's what to expect. You were really kind of on your own. And as we get a little bit more into specific situations and strategies that I encountered, I can anecdotally tell you about some of the frustrations of some of my colleagues who were also like me, kind of like recreating ourselves every day in terms of how we would work with our class. So no, there was not anything that was really structured or helpful beforehand. It was really just, are you interested in doing this? Fine, send a syllabus. Did that. Here's a contract, read it over, sign it, and that's kind of how it went. By then we were of course dealing by email, but that was about it. And it was a very nice contract. I mean, they fly you over there, they put you up, they pay for transportation while you're there, laundry, they reimburse you for a certain amount of food, they pay you a salary. It's all very good. But it was all, when I first got that letter, I was kind of like, okay, I'm going to go with this until they ask me for some money up front. Then I'm going to know what's going on. Turned out to be okay. Anyway, think twice before you speak. Yeah, that's what those Chinese characters mean, and this is part of the doctrine of means of Confucius. And boy, do these students take that to heart. They are very careful about speaking out of turn or speaking too hastily, which can sometimes mean silence. And again, it's kind of like having to draw them out. They're not inclined, as many Western students are, to offer the first opinion that pops into their head. Right? No, seriously though, I mean, in our Western dynamic, we encourage open discussion and let's just throw out a bunch of ideas, and you know, everybody's idea has some merit, and let's kind of pick through them and see how this is going to work out. But there, it's think twice before you speak. That's really what that means. The san si ir jing is what that is. And I mean, that is another thing that's just really embedded. I mean, it's just more than a nice saying. It's something that's really embedded in them growing up as they interact in their families, in society, in school. This is really how they're taught. That if you're going to say something, it better be something really worthwhile and show some insight and some forethought. That you don't just speak rashly, hastily, abruptly. Because why? Well, that would be immodest, wouldn't it? So silence is actually encouraged. That students are encouraged to listen and meditate on what they're listening to and learning, like in a lecture format, instead of responding. And that shows also respect for the teacher. That if they're showing silence, it's showing respect for the teacher. They're not challenging the teacher in any way. Right? Silence means is a good thing. Collectivism. It's a collectivist society. We sometimes forget that when we're over there because a lot of China seems quite westernized, especially when you're over there as a U.S. professor teaching English language courses. You sometimes forget what kind of culture you're living in. But it's a top-down, patriarchal, hierarchical culture. It's collectivist, it's communist. You know, it's a communist country. Sometimes forget about that. You get reminded once in a while. For example, we always had to carry when we got there, we had to go to a police station, turn in our passport. We got it back the next day, which is always a little scary. Well, you'll get this back tomorrow. I'm like, really? My passport here? Okay, fine. But it did come back the next day, but it came back with a photocopy and a document that was basically your approval from the local police department that you can walk around the street. But they can stop you at any time and just say, got the document? And some of my, not me, but some of my colleagues were stopped and they'll just pull up, guys will get out. Do you have your papers? I mean, really? Yeah, so you better have your papers, okay? So it's a collectivist society. I mean, it's all top down. In the city of Guangzhou, where I was at, for example, the city has been growing so fast that there's too many private cars on the street. The streets are getting clogged. While I was there, they just announced on the news one night, all private car sales in Guangzhou will be stopped until further notice. That was it. No questions asked. And then they had a couple interviews with people that sell cars for a living. And they're like, I don't know. What are you going to do? But that was just, you know, it's top down. Well, anyway, in this kind of collectivist society, the group always outweighs the individual, right? The group decision outweighs the individual's desires, wants, or needs. How does this filter down to the students in your classroom? Well, they're more comfortable with a group. They would tend to follow a group idea, and they're very hesitant to step out and state an individual opinion or even hold an individual opinion that might counter the group. So this is a matter of modesty. It's also just a matter of comfort zone, that they're not very comfortable stepping out and talking outside of the group context or talking outside of, talking about anything that the group would not approve of. Now here's a colleague story, right? One of my colleagues taught political science there. Wow. He really had a tough time because he could not get the students to talk about anything about their home country, China. And when he was talking about, so what do you think about the Chinese economic reforms? Is it going too fast? Is it going too slow? The government is trying to slow things down. They're devaluing the money. What do you think? Do you think that works? How do you think the United States feels about that? Because some of the United States aren't very happy about the working relationship we have. Nobody's going to say anything, right? Because no matter what they say, it's going to be an individual expression, and chances are if they say something that might counter what the Chinese government is doing, that could be seen as not only immodest but just unwise, right? So that's when it's time for silence and meditation as opposed to speaking out. Now in a music class we're not quite dealing with such politically charged things, and the students, you know, when I try to elicit responses from them and talking more about opinions and did you like that versus that, or what did you think about that, but kind of the same thing. They're very careful about individual opinions and overstepping their own importance or overstepping with their ideas. And finally, there's language. I mean, you might think language would be one of the biggest things, of course, as a stumbling block. It wasn't really for me. I mean, a lot of these students, you remember, have been in the United States for a year or two already. So they've already been taking a full load as American students in U.S. universities. Their language skills are pretty good. Not always great, but usually pretty good. They're pretty good with reading. Speaking is okay. Writing is tough. Writing is really tough, and you really got to be careful what you do in terms of assessing students through their writing skills. It's usually not a very good assessment of what they really know. Undergraduate level English skills are definitely worse than graduate level. And here's the problem that we find. A lot of Chinese students, even the ones like right here at UAF or in other American universities, they're really good at certain technical style language, like they can speak computer science, or they can speak mathematics, and they can speak, you know, the terminology in physics, but sometimes they have a hard time speaking outside of their comfort zone again. And all of my students that I had, none of them are music majors because they were just taking these as elective courses, right, the music classes. So all of a sudden we're talking about things that are in French, German, and Italian. That was, and then we're talking about submediant triads and dominant seventh chord resolution, and it got pretty tough for some of them because now we're using specific terminology that is not in their field, and that made things a little bit tough. Finally, academic honesty under this whole society thing here too. This is a kind of a big deal. And I know I'm on video and this is probably going on the web, but I'll say it anyway. Academic honesty is it's kind of an issue with some students in China. The focus is definitely more on the product than the process. I already told you that they're great at memorization. Well, that can border on plagiarism. If you give extensive writing assignments to many Chinese students, they will plagiarize if they have the opportunity, and they, in many cases, really don't see anything wrong with that. That's one thing we were kind of warned about going in, and especially for the teachers that were teaching things like English. I mean, we had teachers that were teaching creative writing English, how to write a paper, how to write an essay. You had to be very, very explicit about their expectations for academic honesty in that way. And I can almost understand it. Their writing skills are kind of weak. They understand they need to produce in that area. And again, the product is more important than the process. So academic honesty is a little bit of an issue in some classes when you're dealing with Chinese students who are trying to work in English. I really didn't have that particular problem. Some situations and strategies in the music classroom. If you have a lack of participation and a lack of an abundance of silence, I should say, an abundance of nothing. What can you do about that? I don't know if you'll ever be faced with that problem. I don't know. You're teaching K through 12. I don't know if you're ever going to... You might feel like you're walking into a transcultural context when you walk into your classroom, especially, you know, if your kids are kind of like mine. It's like, huh? You know, it's the time like trying to dialogue with what are we talking about? But, so there might be some of that, but you're probably not going to have lack of participation or silence problems in your room. But if you do, how can you adapt your teaching style if you are working in a transcultural kind of thing? Here's something that works really well. I've even done this with you and you may not even know it. Engage the students in the class before you speak. Because once you start speaking, well, some students will just put the blinders on or tune you, whatever they're going to do, whatever their custom is in your class, they're going to start it as soon as you go, okay, class. You know, they're locked in to what they're doing. And you have a lot harder time moving students around when they're sort of locked into the mode, right? If you engage students before you speak, you've got a way to sort of, it makes them a little more malleable and a little more open. And so start class sessions with inactive listening opportunities. How have I done that here?
Play music.
Play music before you walk into the theory classroom. And I did that with my students in China too. That was very odd for them. They come in and they hear music and they look around, they start getting their stuff out like, are we supposed to be writing something down? It's like, no, don't just sit down. We're just listening. We're just going to listen to the music and it's okay if you talk now, you know, and they finally got the hang of that. But it was very odd. It's like something's happening in the class. Maybe I should do something. It's like, no, just sit back and enjoy. And then that gave me an opportunity to say, you know, did you like that? Or, you know, anybody have a question about that music? And eventually we would start to get a little more dialogue going at the very beginning of the class. It kind of set the tone for the rest of the time, right? So that's one thing you can do in any classroom, is engage the students before you speak. Find ways to do that. Maintain an invisible control of the classroom. This kind of applies anywhere, doesn't it, really? What do you think I might mean by invisible control of the classroom?
The way you're situated in the room.
Yeah, it could mean anything. It could mean where you stand, your body language, how you've arranged the class. Did you move the chairs around? Where's the board? How are the lights set? Do you have papers out? Do you have stuff written on the board? You know, I mean, all of that is part of your control of the environment, but also control of what's going to happen in the classroom as well. So invisible control are all the things that you do that the students are not necessarily aware of, but you are hyper aware of what you're doing in the classroom. I found that that was really important, because particularly as I stepped into the class and started struggling a little bit with students who were not responsive or were, you know, just not creating a very interactive dynamic, I really wanted to get that going. So I had to sort of set the framework for that by taking control of the classroom, and I even, you know, moved students around to certain seats. They wanted to be spread out in the room. I made them all sit together in kind of a group where I could actually say, okay, now you two are going to do this, you two are going to, you know, I got them situated that way so I could find ways to make the class more interactive. I could also maintain my eye contact with the students when they were all in a group, instead of talking to one student over here while this student can't see who I'm talking to. Little things like that. So I created an atmosphere and then actively tried to maintain invisible control of the classroom. So they didn't even know what I was doing. Be prepared for each class session. Now, again, these things just apply to any kind of teacher, right? But this is like ultra prepared. Be prepared for each class session. And I mean, I was like teaching music fundamentals and making lecture notes about music fundamentals. Why? Because all of the techniques, all of the terms, all of the activities that I wanted to do, I had to like really test them out for myself. I had to really think about every move I was going to make in the class. Is this going to work? Didn't work so good yesterday. What can I do different today? You know, or they seem to really respond to this. This seems to really connect. Maybe I could teach this little topic by doing kind of more of what I did the other day. So ultra prepared to teach. And then, here's the flip side of that. once you're ultra prepared to teach, then you have to be ready to go in the classroom and ditch it if it's not working. And I did that on more than one occasion, where I went in ultra prepared. We're going to cover these pages in the book, and we're going to look at this example and that example and this example, and I'm going to play this example for them at the keyboard, and had it all worked out, right? And then we're going to do this handout in class, and we're all going to sit in little groups of 2, and I just, you know, things just weren't working. They were just looking at me, and I wasn't getting the responses, and you know, when I wanted to do a handout in class thing, they really didn't know where to start, and getting bogged down, and I just had to ditch it and find a different way to work. So you've got to be like really ready to go off script. And this might seem counterintuitive, but really the way to free yourself up and be flexible to go off script is to come in prepared. You know, off script doesn't mean you just walk in the door and it's like, hey, what's happening? You know, I mean, that's one way to go off script. But it's better to go in prepared and then get ready to move in any direction that you need to still get your objectives taken care of. I mean, you're still trying to teach, you're still trying to hit a target, you're still trying to engage your students, but you just may have to take different means to do it. Break the lecture cycle. Oh boy. And this was a tough one, because when I walked in on day 1, there were the students all sitting in their various seats, pens out, clean sheets of paper, ready to go, you know? And what they were expecting was, you know, Dr. Post was going to come in and stand at this little lectern thing over here and deliver a lecture. Well, it didn't work that way, obviously. This was a music theory class, or even in the appreciation class, you didn't do lecture, moved around the room, we were listening and putting things up on the board. And, you know, it was not like that. So it was really tough for them to adjust. Even on day 1, they realized that this is not going to be the standard class. Remember, they're not music students, right? So when the professor comes in, puts his books over here, and then goes sits at the piano and talks to them for 20 minutes from the piano, that's kind of like weird. Should I be taking notes? Am I supposed to write any of this down? You know, and it was just a whole new thing for them. But I let them know right away that this is not a lecture class, and you're not going to respond to me in the accustomed way that you respond to your calculus professor or your sociology professor or something like that. This is a different kind of topic and a different kind of class. So one way to break the lecture cycle was to plan the class in modules of different kinds of activities. Sometimes there was lecture. Sometimes it was better to stand in front of the class and just explain something to them and put some things up on the board and just go through it and refer to the book and say, now on page 74 we see example 12b, and look at that. Other times wouldn't hardly refer to the book at all. We would just be off kind of doing something else, a different module, something I would try to make more interactive in-class activity, spontaneous listening, playing something, maybe fielding a question occasionally, not very occasionally at the beginning. But I would just take these opportunities to sort of teach in these different modules where I would sort of have different frameworks of things going on in different activities that we could do. So lecture, discussion, listening, in-class activities. And again, where does that come from? Planning. It can only come from planning. It can't come from, help, I'm lost, I don't know, I've got, these were 90-minute classes. I have 75 minutes left and I don't know what to do. You know, don't want to be in that situation. They'll eat you alive. How about if you're having problems with your transcultural teaching with language and comprehension? You know, what can you do there? Well, first of all, you can change your speaking style. And I guess you kind of have to know your speaking style. I know mine. It's kind of low and slow a lot of times, so that's okay. I've tried to work around it. But even then, many people can slow down. I don't speak particularly fast, but some people speak really, really fast. And they would have to slow down to teach Chinese students in a transcultural context. Speak more deliberately. That means think about what you're going to say. Try to make complete statements and ideas as opposed to speaking in sort of fragmented style. Because they are listening. And the thing is, of course, that's tough for them, is they're hearing you in English, but they're thinking in Chinese. They're taking notes, in Chinese and English, because you might have a handout or they might be looking at the book, so they're reading in English and writing in Chinese. I mean, they're working twice as hard as you are in some senses, right? So you really need to think about how can I communicate to them in a way that they can really process this information. And some of it is simply in how you speak. So slow down, be more deliberate. You don't have to say so much. You don't have to say a lot of things 2 or 3 times like you do with American students. They'll usually get it the first time because they're really listening. They're really listening. No. And watch your verbiage. By that I mean just watch the words that you use. Don't be stilted. Don't try to impress with your vocabulary. Just use plain English. Speak in plain terms. Watch the colloquialisms. If you say, well, that's like water under the bridge. They might look out the window. So be careful about how you just throw words around, I guess is what I'm saying. Connect your lecture with the whiteboard diagrams and the work that you might have in an outline or something. If you give them something that's structured on the board or in an outline form or something, then make sure that's something that you really intend to follow. They will get very confused, as a lot of students do, but particularly students who are taking copious notes, thinking in 2 languages at once, writing in 2 languages at once, and then you are putting something on the board and talking about something completely other than that, and not coming. That is just death for your class. I mean, they are just going to they're going to be confused. They're not going to be responsive, and you've really kind of disengaged them. And, you might think you're doing great with all of the detail and things that you're putting up here, but stay with it. And again, it's in preparation. Make sure that what you intend to show them visually is the same kind of thing that you're going to orally talk about and demonstrate as well. Provide handouts and worksheets. Students want examples. Yeah, this is really true. I found this with my students, that they're great at listening. They will work really hard at reading and following along with everything you're doing, but they learn best by just doing it. And why is that? Well, part of it's the double language thing. When they're reading off of the board or reading from the book, they're translating. When they're listening to you, they're translating. When they're working alone or with another Chinese student on a handout or something in the class, they're singular. They're just focused, and they're sort of in their comfort zone, and they can work. So I found that I could talk about part writing with 4-voice texture, right, and how the 7th of a 7th chord resolves down by step. But it was a lot better just to illustrate that and then have them do it like 10 times over, and they were much better with that kind of thing. They were also more responsive that way. Once they got involved in actually doing some part writing or a harmonic analysis, I even had them doing like rounded binary form analysis and all that. It was pretty impressive, really, for a fundamentals class. Once they started doing some of these things, there was much more interest in discussing between themselves and discussing with me. But when I kind of kept this barrier here about, I know everything on this end of the room and behind me, this is the font of knowledge, come and get it. That really was not the best approach. That's when there was a little bit of disconnect. But when we started doing things together and they started working in a more natural learning environment for themselves, it was much, much better. Avoid bells and whistles. By this, I mean many teachers are inclined to sort of supplant poor teaching plans with media and noise and lights, right? I sometimes call it just the light show. We're going to put on a light show today because I really don't have anything substantial to talk about. I have to admit some of my colleagues were guilty of this, and I don't want to disparage them. They'll never watch this, right? Okay. Some of my colleagues, well, some of them were not the most natural teachers. They were researchers, but they were now teaching undergraduates, and they probably hadn't taught undergraduates for quite a while. So some of them were kind of at a loss for what to do in the classroom, and they sometimes relied, I think, too heavily on trying to use DVDs and videos and light show, basically. And the students, I think, saw through that fairly quickly. According to how some of my colleagues were talking about it, they said that still wasn't generating much insight or much discussion either. And I found that a lot of that was really just sort of a cover for they really didn't know how to talk to their students and present the information. You know, there's that old saying that says, those that do, and those who can't teach. That's a real insult to everybody here, isn't it, right? Unfortunately, those who can't teach do, and that's the problem. The way I see it. So avoid bells and whistles. I use some multimedia to various success. First of all, there's no Facebook or YouTube in China, so that's out. You can't use that. It's not allowed, right? Why? They say so. It's not allowed, okay? But, of course, the students who study now in the United States, they have Facebook. They just can't use it in China, right, when they're home. But I did use some DVDs, and you might remember from the 200X class, I showed this series, How Music Works, with Howard Goodall, this British composer who talks about the history of opera as being one of the great moments in music history, and he talks about how music works and harmony, and it's a great BBC series. How do you think that went over? No? Oh, it's it's got great music, it's got great production values. I mean, you remember it, right?
Yeah, it was really good.
It was really good. Didn't go over so well with my students in my appreciation class, and I was really kind of mystified, but they finally told me, they said, we couldn't understand a word he said. He's got a very thick British accent, the King's English, you know, but it's a really heavy accent, and guess what? He talks really, really fast, right? So they appreciated some of the music, and they appreciated the light show, but did they really get much out of it? No. And so that was kind of a disappointment to me, and I had actually kind of planned to use a number of those, and I had to scrap them. I said, okay, we're not going to watch any more of those videos, so now what, right? So be careful about bells and whistles. It can be a cover, and you may not get the results that you really want. Limit essay style assignments. I think this I'd already kind of mentioned this. If you're dealing with students from non-English cultures, and especially if they have had limited background in studying English, writing is usually the worst. It's usually the last thing that comes along. And so you're really, in a sense, and there might be some that would disagree with me. I suppose there's some teachers that would say, look, you're taking a U.S. standardized Western class and you're getting full semester credit, you better be able to write something. But on the other hand, I would think, are you really testing the students about what they know if you're giving them a lengthy assignment and putting a lot of emphasis on writing a skilled essay when this is obviously a weak area for them? I mean, can you possibly organize your class so that it's not based on a final research paper or written essay just because you've always done it that way? So you might have to rethink how you emphasize writing skills versus more quantitative things in terms of what you do in the class. Not so much of an issue in music, but you know, even in some music classes we do writing, like music appreciation or 200X. Finally, let students learn from one another. Plan time for small groups. This was enormously great for my students. When I broke them up into groups of 2 or 3 students, you know, and had them discuss, you know, let's listen to this piece of music, and we put on a piece of music. Now I want you to write down some characteristics of the genre, what kind of instruments are being used here, does the music sound like it's for what kind of occasion, what time period, you know, questions like that. Instead of peppering the class with questions, I just let them go discuss it in groups of 2 or 3, and of course they're speaking in Chinese, but that's great, that's fine. You know, I had no idea what they were talking about, but you know, it was great. And then they would come back, they'd be somewhat energized, and guess what? They had a group dynamic going now, right? So they were pretty comfortable in forming their group opinion. And that was a great way to let them learn from one another. There's some things that I just can't tell them because I just can't tell them in a way that they're really going to appreciate it, but they can tell one another. And we even see that here with students in our classes. If you sometimes let a peer explain something to a peer, it works. You know, it doesn't mean you're not doing your job. It doesn't mean that you're devaluing anything you're doing in the class. You're actually just giving them another way to get the material. And sometimes, you know, being the professor, you don't explain or understand how the students actually learn. in each and every case. The nice thing for me was I had a TA. All of us had TAs. TAs were great because they helped with the language significantly. The TAs kept office hours, and the students would regularly go to the TA's office hour to talk with them in Chinese, right, about the class. And that was a lifesaver for a lot of students, that they could talk about musical stuff in that particular way. And the TAs also served another important purpose. They helped manage the class. Again, this kind of goes back to that Confucian style thing, like it would be very inappropriate for me as a professor to give students handouts in the class. You don't walk by and touch students or give them handouts. You don't even collect homework. That would be like, what is this professor doing? You know, he's come down from the pedestal and he's like among us. You know? So that's what the TA is for. It's to keep the students comfortable. The TA handles all of the paperwork, the handouts, collects all of the assignments, puts them in nice, neat little stacks for honorable professor. So it's a way again to just kind of keep them comfortable in the classroom. Well, now I'm kind of beyond my half an hour, but here's now just some pictures. That's my little talk about using strategies in the classroom, many of which you can use in any classroom, but they really work well with students who are in a transcultural context. So let me tell you a little bit about this. This is my TA. This is Junyi. He was a great guy. He worked his buns off. He's not a music student. He's a geography major. But when he found out he was going to be my TA, he got the textbooks in the summer, like in May, and I showed up at the end of June, and he had read both the textbooks, completely read them, and was ready to go. I mean, amazing. I mean, he was telling students about music theory, tutoring them in office hours, and he's a geography major. Great guy. Here's a couple students just doing a little, oh, there's Junyi in the background. He's also an interpreter sometimes. This is a couple of students who were just practicing some conducting and sight reading skills things. These are 3 students who were in my music appreciation class. I took some of my students to a classical music concert. They'd never been to one. They'd never seen an orchestra, so after listening to orchestral music for like 5 out of 6 weeks, I took them to an orchestra concert because a professional orchestra was in town just for a performance. And they played. There was a award-winning pianist. He won the Tchaikovsky. He was there, a Chinese pianist, and he was there performing Rachmaninoff's Third. So it was a really cool concert. Anyway, so there's 3 of them. This is Lola and Renee and Mika. And this is some of our faculty having a little al fresco lunch here, sitting out on a deck, and this is how you eat meals in China. You just put it all in the middle, and everybody just passes stuff around. So that, yeah, that's how we often had meals together. This is part of the Opera House. That's the interior of the Opera House in Guangzhou, where we were attending the concert. Here's the exterior with some of the tall buildings in the background. More. There's a little park right across the street from the building that we were teaching in, and there's this huge lotus pond here. There's a couple of them on campus, and they're really beautiful little parks with lotus ponds. The lotus has a lot of special significance in China because the lotus grows up in mud. It grows up in a muddy pond, and so it represents determination and perseverance and faithfulness. The lotus also has a strong reed that can bend in all directions, but you can hardly break it, so it's strength under adversity. So lotus ponds are really popular. They're all over the place in the parks, and many people just sit and hang out at the lotus pond parks and meditate on little benches and things like that. So there's one of those. This is my apartment building that I lived in, like 8th floor. It's probably down here somewhere, kind of dwarfed by some other apartment buildings, and this is pretty much typical of the skyline there. You can see it's a subtropical place. When I was there, which was all of July and half of August, we got over 100 degrees on several days. It was like a broiler with really big, high humidity. The Pearl River runs right through town, and they illuminate the bridges and the buildings that run along the Pearl River through the mid part of the city at night. And you can take riverboat cruises, and there's a beautifully illuminated bridge that crosses the Pearl River. Went to several Buddhist temples, which are open to the public to visit, though they're of course active temples. and many of the people will come and burn incense and leave things here up on this like altar area. Often they'll leave food and things, and the monks will collect the food and distribute it to people who need it. These are actual gold statues, about 600 years old. Oh, there's the poster for the concert we went to. That pianist is 21 years old. He's a really amazing guy. This is the Macau Symphony Orchestra from that little area of Macau. It's an actual professional orchestra. The director here started the orchestra several years ago, and he was European trained and conducted opera orchestras all over Europe and Italy, and then decided to come back to China and do his own thing. There's the inside of the concert hall. That's a pretty spectacular place, isn't it?
Does Guangzhou have?
Yeah, Guangzhou. No, they don't.
They have this.
They have this place. This is actually the opera house, and they don't have a resident opera company. So they have orchestras that come in, and they have ballets and operas and touring companies that come in all the time. But they built this incredible place in 2006, and they don't even have a resident orchestra or opera company. Yeah. There's the orchestra. They were great. They also played Ravel's orchestration of Mussorgsky's. Come on, I just found it.
The pictures?
Pictures at an exhibition, right? The whole thing. Yeah, that was great. And they played Debussy's Prelude to the Afternoon of the Faun. That was the opening. It was a really great concert. A lot of China looks more like this, though. You get outside of the city, and pretty much you can drive by miles and miles of this. If you don't see this, what you see is factories. So it's either farming and agriculture right outside the city, or just miles of smokestacks. As a matter of fact, when my TA met me at the airport and we took a cab going back into the city, we went past just miles and miles of smokestacks and factories. And he made a funny line. He goes, "This is where made in China is made in China." He was right. Oh, there's me. So this is my favorite little hangout down on the corner. Myself and a guy named Rich and a couple others, we kind of just had sort of regular standing thing. Hey, what are you doing for dinner? You want to go down the street? Okay, so we go down there. It's like a little mom and pop shop. Great food, and typical of the Chinese, you know, it's the chopsticks and the I did not use a fork, honestly, for 6 weeks. I did not use a fork. I ate the chopsticks, and it was pretty cool. So it's kind of funny because when that family-style dining thing, apparently it applies to if you're eating with just one other person, because I would sometimes go with Rich and we'd order like a couple of different plates of stuff, and he'd say, "I'm going to get these," and I said, "I'm going to get these," and you know, we're eating our own stuff, right? That's what guys do. They invent my stuff, right? Eating my stuff. Well, the way the server would come back and check on our tea and stuff, and she'd look at the table and see two, and she'd be like, she'd start moving stuff around, putting it all back in the middle like we're supposed to share. It's like, no, we want it. This is mine. So that's that. Anyway, so I just, you know, I hope you enjoyed that. I had a great time. I've been invited to go back, but this summer I'm going to Shanghai, so that's going to be great. Guangzhou was nice, but you know, once I've been there 6 weeks, 7 weeks with travel on either end, I feel like I kind of did that place. Even, you know, maybe not fair to say 12 million people, there's probably a lot more to do, but you know, I'm really looking forward to going to Shanghai. Better facilities, it's, you know, bigger city, so it's going to be pretty exciting. Anyway, thank you for letting me share that with you.